Hi everyone, are we ready to go?
Just a few seconds, Patter.
Great, okay.
Patter, you're on mute.
Hi everybody, many greetings to you all, and welcome to the webinar from the Power and Popular Politics Cluster. I have to apologise on behalf of Alex Shankland, who was your chair. He's lost internet connection, and so I'm standing in for him, and I hope I'll manage to do even half as good a job as he would have been able to. But anyway, we will proceed. We're delighted today to have Professor Felisa Anaya, visiting fellow with the Power and Popular Politics Cluster here at IDS, who's working with us on power and politics in relation to traditional peoples and pastoralists for a year as a visiting fellow at IDS. And she's coming to the end of her visiting fellowship and is offering this very interesting webinar. Felisa is a professor at the State University of Montes Claros, Brazil. Felisa teaches in the graduate programs in social development and in society, environment and territory there. She's an interdisciplinary social environmental researcher who looks at development, environmental conflicts, social movements and traditional peoples and communities. She's coming to the end of her fellowship, as I said, and during her time here, she's also worked with us on a comparative paper about defensive strategies in traditional territories in Kenya and Brazil. I first met her last year when I had the honor to be invited to speak at one of the remarkable Montes, that's the University of Montes Claros, colloquia, which are a series of gatherings of indigenous and traditional peoples and also academics from Brazil and from Latin America more widely, and also from Europe. And these dialogues have been going on for more than a decade. And the organizing team is seeking to promote dialogue between social movements of traditional and indigenous peoples and academics working with them on knowledge and policy and struggle. And the sixth colloquium, which I had the amazing delight of being able to attend, involved 600 people in a multiplicity of conversations and convocations. It brought the peoples together in solidarity with one another and with scholars who very often would otherwise have missed the chance of cooperation. And I was there as part of the colloquium's effort to expand its reach now even further across the world, and in my case into a connection with East Africa. For this seminar webinar, thanks are due to the Brazil Hub at IDS for support. Felisa is the first visiting fellow to be with us since this hub was officially launched in May. And we expect she'll be the first of many, hosted by this hub, which is the Brazil International Development Research and Mutual Learning Hub, a coming together that's focused on the transformation of development studies, both in Brazil and with Brazil. My task as chair is to do this introduction, and then I'm going to transmute into the discussant, which is to, as a discussant, I want to make connections to the processes that Felisa will tell us about in rich detail, by which racialized environmentalism undermines institutions and enables violence. to suggest that this story has resonance with forms of racial and environmental violence experienced by communities in other parts of the world. So we're working here on connecting the networks, creating mutual learning between peoples with whom Felisa works and with whom many of the rest of us also work. So her paper on racialized anti-environmentalism and resistance in the Middle San Francisco River in Brazil, it's based on the need to expand an understanding of something that many of us are aware of. There has been a lot of international attention to violence against the rights of indigenous and traditional communities in the Amazon in Brazil, for instance. But Felisa's presentation will help us to understand how the issues that affect the Amazon apply in other parts of Brazil, including in the central Cerrado savanna region, and suggesting that this violence is a generalized phenomenon. And it's not only in Brazil, of course, but in many other countries of Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere. And Felisa will show us how this is working, where she's been in the heart of Brazil, which is the San Francisco River, a central artery that runs all the way across Brazil from its far southeast to its far south, northeast, southeast and northeast. Felisa will put me right on that one. The current political and economic situation in Brazil is very much the frame for what's happening now. It's shaped by the emergence of a new type of authoritarian and racialized anti-environmentalism, which Felisa will tell us about. She will explain how the pressure for the liberalization of public lands and communal territories by big agribusiness is accompanied by stigmatization of indigenous peoples, of peoples like the quilombolas and the traditional communities, and also the spaces in which environmental preservation was supposed to have been protected. All of these have been identified as obstacles to development, and the rhetoric has been used as an effective strategy to convince large parts of society in Brazil and elsewhere, and to legitimize practices of environmental and land rights deregulation and indeed violence. So now I'm going to hand over to Felisa with many thanks. Felisa.
Unmute. Wait a minute, please. Now, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I would like to thank Rachel for the organization, this event, and especially Apata and Alex, who received me in IDS, and the persons who I'm working at the moment. So a lot of thanks to them too. Well, how I say, the purpose of this discussion is to analyze the challenges of the work of identifying and characterizing lands traditionally occupied by Vazanteiras and Quilombolas communities located in the middle basin of the San Francisco River, based on the experience of the interdisciplinary social environmental cluster at the State University of Montes Claros, called NISA, carried out from 2016 to 2019, and which became anthropological reports and social environmental diagnosis for the land regularization of their territories through a project that I coordinated called San Francisco Dynamics, Identification and Characterization of Traditionally Occupied Lands. This research was carried out in parallel with the process of reconfiguring the modus operandi of agribusiness agents in the region, who began to publicly use arguments of criminalization and disqualification of these groups, social movements, and researchers. The agribusiness segment agency involved the construction of strategies to convince public opinion against the demarcation process of the federal areas, articulating local political actions to the interest of the agribusiness group in the national scope. Among the strategies we can observe, first, the naturalization of racism and the disqualification of public research institutions and land regularization, through reports in the media and on social networks with false content. Second, the performance of armed militias intimidating movements and social groups in the countryside. And lastly, the deconstruction of public policies aimed at the democratization of access to land and the recognition of territorial rights of traditional peoples and communities. To describe this process, first, I'm going to introduce the political situation in Brazil, shaped by the emergence of a new type of anti-environmentalism, which has changed from the slow violence to bare violence. After, I'm going to describe the area of study and present who the traditional communities Vazanteiras and Quilombolas are, as well as the main socio-economic and political dynamics responsible for the process of confinement of these groups in the aisles and riversides of the São Francisco River, a space legally considered as federal land. Secondly, I'm going to outline the research production context in the process of judicialization as a strategy of slow violence, and finally, how the context of racialized anti-environmentalism emerged from slow violence to bare violence. So the current political and economic situation in Brazil is shaped by the emergence of the new type of anti-environmentalism, of an authoritarian and racialized character. It is a kind of tropicalized version of American environmental racism. However, produced in a context of reconfiguration in the power frameworks through the equipping of state institutions by agents of agribusiness segment and the more conservative segment of the armed forces, who previously defended their agendas in minority positions in the Congress and today occupy decision-making positions in the government. The pressure for the liberalization of public lands and communal territories by the agribusiness segment is accompanied by a rhetoric of stigmatization against indigenous peoples, quilombolas, and traditional communities, as well as space for environmental preservation identified as obstacles to development. In this rhetoric, the ethnic issue emerges from its colonial historical roots, linked to the biologist and refined notion of race. Associated with this rhetoric of stigmatization is the rhetoric of intransigence, present in the discourse of right political groups, as discussed in Hirschman's studies, in which the main argument is based on the threat ceases. The effects of this rhetoric are evidenced by the fight against the processes of democratization of access to land in Brazil, through the refusal of the legitimacy of environmental, land, and territorial regulations, by questioning the legal attribution of public institutions and researchers responsible for the studies that support the demands for land regularization of indigenous people and traditional communities. As an example, we can mention the attempts to impose the adoption of the time frame thesis for indigenous and quilombolas lands, and the establishment of the National Indian Foundation's Parliamentary Inquiry Committee in the House of Representatives, composed mostly of members of the agribusiness lobby, known as FUNAI's CPI. At this moment, indigenous leaders, anthropologists, and public agents from the Federal Public Ministry, the Colonization and Agrarian Reform Institute, known as INCRA, and the FUNAI, were summoned to respond to to alleged irregularities in land demarcation processes. It is important to highlight that the Federal Public Ministry is the institution in charge of guaranteeing the constitutional rights in Brazil and has an important role in the defense of the rights of traditional peoples and communities. This institution started to be attacked by political forces linked to the agribusiness sector, the same occurring with the INCRA, FUNAI, and the universities, with the latter being responsible for producing studies that support the land tenure regularization for these groups. It seems curious that the priority targets of these initiatives are the federal public lands and the areas of permanent preservation, on which a large part of the recognition processes are based, and not private property, as alleged in the arguments evoked by the agribusiness. It's from the context of authoritarian and racialized anti-environmentalism that I seek to understand the process of environmental deregulation and territorial rights that involves disputes for the privatization of water and public lands in federal areas in the southwest of Brazil. Well, considered one of the most important perennial water courses in Brazil, the São Francisco River is the most extensive hydrographic basin, which is exclusively national. It interconnects the northeast and southwest regions of the country and covers 6 states: Goiás, Bahia, Pernambuco, Alagoas, Sergipe, and Minas Gerais, plus the federal district. Because it crosses more than one state, the Brazilian Constitution of 1988 considers it a federal river, and its management is the responsibility of federal government. It has an extension of 2,700 kilometers and is divided into 4 hydrographic regions, defined as Upper, Middle, Sub-Middle, and Lower São Francisco River. The study area presented here corresponds to the Middle São Francisco, a stretch that is located between the state of Minas Gerais and Bahia. Its length represents 63% of the total area of the basin. The São Francisco River was strategic in the process of colonization and Portuguese occupation in the interior of the countryside. During the 16th century, Africans escaping from slavery penetrated the interior of this region, which is covered by a dense arboreal forest, consisting of small lagoons in which malaria was present. This forest served as a structural barrier of natural obstacle to white man occupation. During the colonial and imperial periods, several small Black groups gave rise to a set of localities that housed a multicultural and multi-ethnic society called the Black Territory of Jaíba. In this territory, such groups were structured through the logic of reciprocity and freedom, and they occupied free lands and lived with autonomy. Organized in family groups that were located at a distance from each other, the families articulated themselves through kinship, marriage, and godparenthood. From the 17th century on, the white man occupation penetrated the region with the arrival of bandeirantes, riders from Bahia and São Paulo, who aimed to exterminate and enslave indigenous groups and to capture runaway African slaves. In this scenario for the colonial society, the Quilombola identity emerged in reference to Black men fleeing slavery. However, it is noteworthy that currently the term Quilombo has been reframed in relation to the colonial conception to refer to the present situation of several Black Brazilian communities. Quilombolas are inserted in the constitutional text of 1988 as new subjects of rights, as the definition of Quilombo in empirical operation terms generalize its characteristics descriptively defining its normative character: rurality, peasant livelihood, land in common use, secular possession, adaptation to criteria of ecological resource preservation, presence of conflicts and antagonisms experienced by the group, and finally, but not exclusively, a political mobilization defined in terms of quilombola self-identification. It's from the meeting of cultures and territorialities of the Black and indigenous groups that historically inhabited the São Francisco River area that the traditional Vazanteiras Black communities of these studies have their origins. The identity relationship linked to the floods and ebbs of the São Francisco River and to the dynamic management of the isles where they live has created the recognition of people from the growing waters and lands. The ethnic element distinguishing these groups is the ebb agriculture, agricultura de vazantes in Portuguese. The ebb agriculture is called the great tradition by the Vazanteiras communities, a technique transmitted across generations. The question of the right of indigenous people and traditional communities to their territories and ways of life came to occupy the center of the global debate of sustainability. The visibility of these social groups in context of environmental conflicts and the recognition of their role in the preservation of nature contributed to the organization of several events to address these issues in the environmental field. In Brazil, these discussions advanced in academic investigations and in the field of territorial and collective rights, reflected in the legal category of traditional peoples and communities, present in Brazilian social policies through the Federal Decree 6040 of 2007. This decree protects the right to self-representation and identity self-determination, as well as to traditional territory, treated in its correspondence with the category traditionally occupied lands. The way in which these groups appropriate materially and symbolically of the environment is marked by the existence of a collective and family agrarian regime, supported by a set of customary rules and values, which corresponds to one of the various types of appropriation of natural resources. In the case of traditional occupied land by Vazanteiras communities of the São Francisco River, they cover a wide territory composed of dry, non-flooded land, riverside isles, and the river itself that allowed these groups to develop in a communal way ebb and dry farming activities, fishing, animal husbandry, and gathering. The loss of territorial dominance of the dry lands of these groups occurred during a historical process of expropriation, resulting from the economic development policies and environmental policies in which the state and the regional agrarian elite are the main agents. The first cycle began in the 1960s, 70s, with government actions of planned occupation of the Black territory of Jaíba, through policies and programs aimed at the industrialization and modernization of the countryside. A symbol of this process is the establishment of the Jaíba Project, the largest irrigated fruit plantation in Latin America. The second cycle occurred during the expansion of phase 2 of the Jaíba Project that demand a compensation system of wilderness protect areas created over the traditional territories of these groups. The social consequences were the territorial expropriation, migration, land and income concentration, increasing monoculture plantations, degradation of natural resources, and confinement of these groups of the bank and isles of the São Francisco River. This process is identified in the native temporality as cornering. During the research, we georeferenced 81 Vazanteiras and Quilombolas communities confined to the riverbank and isles, cornered by agribusiness companies, large irrigated projects, eucalyptus monoculture, and a set of compensatory protected areas. All these enterprises overlap their traditionally occupied lands. It is worth mentioning that the aisles and the banks of the San Francisco River, as well as the other federal rivers, are protected by specific laws of the agrarian and environmental field. They are identified as areas of permanent protection according to the Brazilian Forest Code, and as federal public lands according to federal legislation. Historically, the non-identification and management of the limits of the public lands have been constituted as strategic elements for the definitions of the relations of political and economical power in all regions of Brazil. The result was the formation of large estates by the private big farmers and unlawful appropriation of the social spaces. However, as of 2003, in the beginning of the first term of the Lula government, the concept of public property and social environmental purposes were reformulated and incorporated into the new structure of the Federal Properties Management Office, otherwise known as SPU, the public institution responsible for identifying, delimiting, and managing public lands in Brazil. The approval of a new management model in this period was a game changer regarding the possibility of land title regularization for social interest in public lands, due to the social territorial inclusion of the most vulnerable section of the populations, mainly traditional communities. For this purpose, the SPU used the term of authorization of sustainable use, otherwise called TAUS, which has its central objective to quickly ensure the use of the territory by the riverside populations. Therefore, the TAUS is considered a transitory, exceptional, and precarious instrument due to the fact that the public areas of control are not yet defined. The process to issue the TAUS in Minas Gerais was initiated in 2016 with the project called San Francisco Dynamics, 3 years after the process of the identifying public areas by the SPU began, with the issuance of the TAUS for Caraíbas communities. The beginning of the work to delimit public lands of federal government in the San Francisco River Basin was triggered by the complaints made to Human Rights Commission by the Quilombolas and Vazanteiras communities, organized politically as Vazanteiros in Movement in the year 2010. Several public institutions linked to the president's office during the Dilma Rousseff's government constituted a commission to investigate the complaints in the Vazanteiros territories. The final report of the commission recommended the SPU to initiate the delimitation of public lands in the state of Minas Gerais, making it possible for the communities cornered on the banks of the San Francisco River to recover their territories. In 2013, the SPU issued the first TAUS in the public lands of the San Francisco River for the Caraíbas, Quilombola, and the Vazanteira community. Since then, the SPU has been strongly questioned administratively and judicially by the agribusiness sector of the region. Despite the TAU's legal challenges, the agency continued its institutional delimitation actions, identifying 307 kilometers of marginal river land in 8 municipalities of Minas Gerais states. It should be noted that during the delimitation field works of the TAUS in the Caraíbas community, the SPU informed the Federal Public Ministry of the impossibility of continuing the delimitation process due to the obstruction of access to public areas by the large owners of the farms. a lawsuit was filed and the return to the field was escorted by the federal police. However, the tension in the conflict was intensified because the big farmers started preventing the SPU's access to public areas in the São Francisco River and preventing the Caraíbas community from accessing the city. Public hearings were convened and several repossessions issued against the Vazanteiras communities in this region, in addition to threats and other types of violence. Shortly after the public hearing, the leadership of the Peasant Association was murdered by the farm manager, and several Vazanteiros leaders joined in the human rights program to protect victims. In July 2015, we held the seminar, Riverside Communities of the São Francisco River, at Unimontes through a partnership between NISA, Unimontes, the 60th Office of the Federal Public Ministry, SPU, INCRA, SEDA, traditional communities, and social movements. As a result of the seminar, social environmental diagnostics and anthropological reports were agreed by NISA Unimontes. And the working group, São Francisco Dynamics, was formed, mediated by Federal Public Ministry and composed of the land regulation institutes mentioned, us, and the communities. In this space, several agreements and commitments were signed between institutions of land regularization, university and research groups, in order to characterize of traditionally occupied lands, including public areas already delimited by the SPU, vacant and private lands that comprised the territories of the selected groups, develop articulate actions by the land regularization institutions. In principle, four communities were selected, and after the fieldwork began, the number was increased to 7, in consideration of territorial and family ties. Among the selected Vazanteiras and Quilombolas communities are the Caraíbas, Croatá, Sangradouro Grande, Várzea da Cruz, and Gamileira, and the Vazanteiras communities of Pau Preto and Pau de Légua. The project started in March 2016 and ended in 2019. We began our fieldwork in the Caraíbas communities because it was the first community with the issuance of TAUs and because of the intense land conflict with big farmers. In 2016, the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and the start of Michel Temer's term as president took place, with the support of the agribusiness representative group in the Brazilian Congress, resulting in changes in power relations in interface with the agrarian issue. The immediate consequence was the replacement of the superintendents of SPU and INCRA in Minas Gerais, who had been maintaining the commitment made with traditional communities during the seminar held in Unimontes. The conjuncture of changes in the government and the direction of the agencies previously mentioned had a direct impact on the institutional political positioning regarding the land regularization of traditionally occupied lands. The dialogue of the superintendents of the SPU of Minas Gerais with the Vazanteiros communities was interrupted, as well as with the researchers and the other institutions of the dynamic São Francisco group. In addition, the SPU started to receive administrative resources from the big farmers, questioning the TAUs and the legitimacy of the social group as a traditional community. Soon, the public hearings convened in 6 municipalities were canceled after the pressure from agribusiness in the region. The public justification given by the new superintendent of the SPU for the suspension of the public hearing was concerned with planned mobilizations and the risk of exposure of employees. In addition to this contest of political change that affected SPU's direction, our research work was crossed by several calls from the researchers to public hearings, institutional mediations, and the production of technical notes to provide clarifications on the traditionality of this group surveyed, threatened by the repeated eviction injunctions. The situation demands from us, impelled by the ethnographic evidence, the presence as experts to innumerable meetings in audience, which included the presence of the big farmers and their managers. Between the cancellation of one public hearing and another, in 2018, the Confederation of Agriculture and Livestock of Brazil, CNA, filed a letter in the Presidents of the Republic requesting the revocation of the Decree 6040, establishing the national policy for the sustainable development of traditional peoples and communities. The document was signed by the President of CNA and by the President of the Parliamentary Group for Agriculture and Livestock, FPA, Ms. Teresa Cristina Correia da Costa Dias, the current Minister of Agriculture of the Bolsonaro's government. The agribusiness questioned the validity of the decree, citing 2 points: the lack of the objectivity in the self-attribution criterion and the multiple interpretations associated with the definition of traditional territories. The allegation used by the agribusiness segment invoked formal vices of unconstitutionality. It was argued that the actions resulting from the decree stimulated and culminated in acts that affront order and security, in addition to violating the constitutional guarantee of protection of private property. So they requested in the document the immediate suspension of the process of delimitation of the public lands in the middle portion of the São Francisco River, initiated by SPU, claiming that such actions have fostered invasions and conflicts throughout Brazil. In this request, they questioned the identity self-attribution and the collective right to traditional territories, triggering the rhetoric of intransigence by relating these issues to the threat to security, order, and private property. Between 2018 and 2019, daily pronouncements against the limitations were made in printed newspapers and electronic media based on fake news. A campaign was carried out in the regional and national media, and a newspaper from the north of Minas Gerais published an article with the president of the Agribusiness Society of Montes Claros, accusing social movements and scientific institutions, Unimontes and Federal University of Minas Gerais, to encourage the ethnic self-declaration of peasant groups and the invasion of private lands in the region, promoting what the sector has been calling quilombolization of the north of Minas Gerais. Shortly thereafter, a weekly series of reports by a Brazilian television broadcaster was released on national television under the headline, "Groups Destroy Vegetation Near the São Francisco River." In this regard, the process of environmental degradation on the banks of the São Francisco River was attributed to quilombolas and vazanteiras communities. This argument was based on the statements of representatives of local and state public institutions that said they were pseudo groups that identified themselves with the objective of obtaining land and invading the productive private property that guarantees the livelihood of their families. The report ends with the speech of a judge from the state of Minas Gerais who refers to public policies for the sustainable development of traditional peoples and communities as populist and mistaken, and should be banned from the banks of the São Francisco River. In the broadcasting of the aforementioned journalist reports by the agribusiness segment, the strategy of erasing the historical and special dimension of the environmental degradation process of the São Francisco River basin draws attention. There is a combined strategy between a rhetoric of intransigence that induces the feeling of fear and insecurity associated with a rhetoric of stigmatization and criminalization of the traditional communities. See WhatsApp's messages that circulated by the agribusiness agents attributing the responsibility for fires in the public lands of the São Francisco River to the traditional communities of the region. The symbolic effects of this rhetoric of the stigmatization, such as quilombalization, invaders, pseudo-groups, among others, has been serving as a strategy to deny constitutional and territorial rights in the legislative field. In the same way, they manipulate public opinion through the criminalization of ethnic groups, social movements, and the disqualification of the action of research groups that work with engaged science. Such rhetoric authorize in the field of material disputes all types of violence carried out through the formation of armed militias linked to the agribusiness segment, such as the movement called Peace in the Countryside, Movimento Paz no Campo in Portuguese, that has been operating in the north of Minas Gerais. This movement has as one of its leaders the current Secretary of Public Security of the state of Minas Gerais. To conclude, I would like to state what the experience of ethnographic research allowed us to observe that historically, the non-delimitation of public lands for the purpose of land tenure regularization of traditionally occupied lands and for agrarian reform in Brazil has been constituted as a strategic element for the definition of political and economic power relationships in all regions of the country. The result was the formation of large private farmlands and unlawful appropriation of the social spaces, having a main focus the extraction of natural resources by large enterprises and the financialization of the land market. In the case of public lands of Federal River, there is a certain indiscriminate condescension of the private use of these areas with market interests, which is linked to what Moreira calls instrumentalized carelessness in the management and discrimination of what is public. A carelessness that contributes to the constitution of a certain slow violence in reference to the category used by Rob Nixon, which is materialized in the bureaucratization of the processes of land regularization in the case of traditional occupied lands, and in the relaxation of the environmental legislation to allow the establishment of large development initiatives, and in the incorporation of mediation and negotiation instruments in the judiciary arena, via market solutions in which interest override rights. In the case of São Francisco River, the construction of policies for the allocation of public lands surrounding federal rivers oriented towards the fulfillment of their social environmental function, and also the institutional strengthening of the SPU from the first term of the Lula government were very important. However, the delay in identifying and delimiting these areas was an additional bureaucratic obstacles, apart from those created by the questioning of the agribusiness, and resulted in the paralysis of the procedures for the delimitation of this area, as well as the indeterminate delay in completing the processes of the land regularization of lands traditionally occupied by the surveyed communities. The context of the conduction of the ethnographic studies of the São Francisco dynamics project have already pointed out to us the reconfiguration of the far right and its power relations in the interior of Brazil. However, we did not imagine what would come with the election of Bolsonaro. The change in the modus operandi of agribusiness in the middle São Francisco River moved from a slow violence to a bare violence, a term recently used by Andrea Zouri. In other words, a change from a liberal anti-environmentalism in which the delimitation of public lands and those traditionally occupied by indigenous people and traditional communities has always been postponed. Meanwhile, these areas were accessible to monoculture, mining, irrigation, and other types of commodities. A new type of anti-environmentalism began, in which violence manifested itself without disguise, in an authoritarian and racist way, reusing a discursive repertoire with colonial roots. The naturalization of this rhetoric and disappearance of criticism in the media and the society authorized actions of violence against ethnic groups and peasants, as well as against protected areas and educational institutions. Such anti-environmentalism is part of the structure of the current government and lead us to a condition of a crisis of democratic state under the law. So the big challenge is how to produce scientific knowledge and counter hegemonic speech in a context of intense fragility of states' regulatory institutions, defense of rights, and the academy itself. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Felisa, for that powerful presentation. Because of the time, because the tradition with our seminars and webinars is that we stop at 2 p.m. UK time for people to break off if they have to go and do other things. And we've normally started questions by now. So I'm also a discussant, but I'm thinking that maybe we should start with some questions, take us till 2. And then I can put in my discussant part at that point. My discussant part being really to agree with what Felisa was saying, to draw up, to find that the patterns that she has identified are very powerful and very valid in other parts of the world, in my case, in East Africa. But I can do that. But I think the first thing we'd like to do is to allow for some questions, particularly if there's anybody who has to leave us at the hour. So I'm now looking at yes, I can see questions in the chat from the YouTube and also the chat from the Zoom. So I'm going to start with the chat from the Zoom. I've got Alexandra Filatova, who says, you refer to social movements several times, Felisa. Could you please detail them? When they were raised and what was their main power engine? So that's Alexandra's question. When did these social movements begin and what powered them along? And then, oh, this isn't a question, this is from, I don't know how to say your name, you know, that's it, who I think probably is saying, congratulations, my Portuguese being 0. So someone else will do that for you. Okay, the second question for you, Felisa. Oh, it's the same question. Okay, so there's your question about social movements.
Okay. Well, it's from Alexandra, right?
Yes.
Thank you for the question, Alexandra. I try to explain. Well, I'm talking about, in Brazil, a general social movements, but in our case, in the São Francisco River, we have a strong social movement that include different traditional communities. In particular, in our study area, we have articulação rosalino by traditional peoples. We have 7 leaders of different traditional communities that they are linked to each other for fight for their rights, for the rights, no, for the rights to the territory, the rights for to maintain your way of life. So these groups in these specific areas, they started from the 1990, after the Constitution of 1988 recognized their rights. So these social movements, they rise in Brazil, in general Brazil, and in the case of our area, it's begin after the 90s, the 90s years. So it's a specific social movement in this case, when I called Vazanteiros in movement, and they present themselves in a wide movement, Articulação Rosalino. So they have other connections of other movements of the region, of the national movements, in the international movements too.
And what gave them their powers when they were powerful, when they still are?
Powers.
Power, yeah. What drove them? What gave them force? Or...
Oh, the main power engine.
Yeah.
Eles pegam as forças, né? Well, these groups, the social groups, they have a kind of a strong basis, a strong relationship with the environment, and they have a kind of formation of the powers with the other communities, with the other agents who help them in the fight. Some ONGs, universities, and mainly between them. So I think with other groups, right? So they learn each other all the time. It's basically this.
Thank you, Felisa. I mean, I think actually that was been one of the things we have been talking about this year. And we got it down in rather simplistic terms to, on the one hand, political opportunity. You know, there were times in the era of Lula and so on, where it became possible for claims to begin to see institutionalization, to see changes in law, to see changes in policy. At the same time, alliances between different traditional peoples, traditional and indigenous, traditional and academic, and so on, became more effective. And the other element that was going on is the traditional people's absolute belief in the rightness of their claims. That it's not just a case of legal right, it's a case of spiritual right, of a sense of very strong tradition. So put those three together and you have a powerful movement. However, when the political opportunities change, then you can see what happens. Rachel's saying something. This will probably link to what Patra is going to speak about, but what do you think of other movements can learn from these experiences and your findings, Felisa? Either other movements in Brazil or in the region or in other parts of the world? Is there learning from what you have observed?
Well, these movements, they teach us a lot of things, mainly resistance. No? These groups, they always lived in situations of crisis, and the resistance, the union of the force among them, it's crucial to do the resistance, I guess. So this is for me is the best thing to learn with them, including how these groups relationship with the nature, how they back to the nature and protect the nature is completely different of the Occidental vision, right? So for me, this is the great contribution. These groups is the relationship of them with the nature and how they linked between them, how they have connections with the other groups and construct other webs. So for me, this is the main contribution for these groups.
That's really interesting. Now, can you see the chat, Felisa? Can you see the chat? So,
okay. Now I'm
see who is the last person? Say the name. So if I read it out, I will get it wrong, and I will be.
João Leonardo Vieira, my student.
Hello. He says, or she says.
From Brazil.
They say about what Rachel said. I remember the title of the pollen conference, the presentation you made, Felisa. Coming out and coming in, that idea of where the strength arises from, that intensive internal work and belief, as well as the engagement with the outside world, which is made effective by the intensity of the internal work, about a strategy of fighting,
yes,
of defensiveness. Okay, so we have just one more minute till 2 o'clock. So I think from now what I will do is I will move to a few comments on my side in the spirit of a discussant. Oh, new questions in chat. Oh, I'm going to the other chat now. Okay, we have one from Matt and we have someone, Lydia Cabral. Okay. So Matt says, what role is the media playing in shifting or morphing narratives that work against vulnerable communities and against just participation? What role is the media playing? Are they acting responsibly or do they fuel anti-environmentalism?
I can't see the...
That's on the... I'll paste it into the chat. Hold on. Sorry. So that's about the media.
Okay.
If I could find a way to make it go. Yeah, there we are. That's from Matt. And then there's a second one from Lydia. On the questioning of traditional identity from above, how the elites question this identity. It seems such an important point, she says, especially if one thinks of the rights of landless people coming from urban areas who may not be traditionally connected to the land, at least for some generations, but are still legitimate claimers of decent livelihoods in a country with high land-based inequalities. To what extent do you think that territorial identity and rights necessitates a link with the traditional? What other dimensions of territorial identity and rights have been or can be mobilized?
Well, let me see if I try to answer the first. The role of the media, right? In this narratives. Well, the media always had with the elite in Brazil. The media give support to this discourse since the dictatorship in Brazil. So the media have a great role in this context, right? And responsible for environmental, okay. But I believe that the same time the media support this discourse, it's the media in Brazil not agreed a lot with this anti-environmentalism, because the media know mainly Amazonia is central of interest of the world. So the media make both sides, are in both sides at the same time, but she have an important role in this this discourse of discrimination, since of the peasant groups, not so a lot of indigenous peoples, but quilombolas and traditional communities and other kind of movement of peasants. The media have coming, cooperating with this discourse of discrimination. The other question, it seems such an important point, especially since rights. People come from. Yes, yes. It's different from the people from the urban cities to recognize the importance of the traditional communities, of the peasants, of the other groups of the rural cities, right? The important role that people have for the city. It's a kind of disconnection, because who sustained the agriculture in Brazil is the familiar agriculture, is the familiar agriculture from the rural parts of Brazil. And a lot of time they have kind of this, have a kind of difficulty to understand the role of these groups for the urban space, and how the people say about traditionality. They think about something linked to the past, but these groups are showing for us that traditionality, like culture, is something dynamic. A tradition is something have changing along of the time, but it's como fala reatualizado? Reupdated. It is reupdated in this time. So the question, the issue of identity in the rights have to, I guess, have to be more clear for the urban people, but it's linked to what the media show for us, for the whole society too. It's not the media. It's not don't show this for the population in general, I guess.
It's a really interesting point that you've raised there, Lydia, that you sort of pointed to, this point of traditionalism, and that Felisa has responded to with this point that the traditional is that which is dynamic today. It's not something ancient, and it has historical roots, obviously, but whether or not that is a lever which can be used against people who speak of their traditional identity with the territory is clearly something of importance, and so perhaps it isn't the words need to change with the changing political circumstances, possibly. The tradition isn't one that's going to give you much strength in the light of how many people, not only the big agribusinesses, but the people in the urban areas who also need you know, need their space, need their land, need their identities. So there you are. That's all very interesting. Let me have a look. See if there's anything else. No, there's nothing else. So can I give you a brief input from myself, just to echo how what Felicia has been saying emerges in another part of the world. I must say, to some degree, I was surprised how much commonality there was between peoples and places that are so very different. But anyway, I found there was this enormous resonance in her story in parts of East Africa where I have worked for many years. The slow violence and the bear violence are there. The patterns are different, but the patterns are also, the basis of these patterns is very similar. And that probably relates to some larger processes that go on in the world in relation to power and money. So I take you very briefly to northern Kenya, where in the olden days, back in the colonial days and then thereafter, conservation alienated large tracts of land from access by what are called there the pastoralist peoples, and development had promoted land use change in the highest productivity areas, the areas where there was water in these dry lands. But it has been really in the last 10 years with the coming of large-scale oil, gas and renewable energy projects, that land is really being annexed on a large scale, and local people are getting truly worried. Incidents of pollution are ignored. Securitization of those areas of land that have been fenced off is on the increase to protect the facilities. And all of this is happening in northern Kenya, despite a constitutionally mandated but much delayed process of community land registration, which sounds similar to what Felicia was talking about in Brazil, which was supposed to protect land rights on a collective basis and across large tracts of commonly not just used land, but land to which the people belonged rather than which belonged to the people. And nonetheless, despite this constitutional land reform process, the institutions that promote economic growth, including Parliament itself, have taken precedence with the arrival of the extractives. With oil, the state and big businesses in which the elites of the state are deeply invested, the state points out that everything below the surface of the ground, I don't know how many feet it is, but it's not very far, belongs to the state. And with renewables, the state points out that everything above the surface of the ground belongs to the state, everything in the air. And annexation of the ground itself has only been a question of the turning of a blind eye to a multiplicity of small incidents of land annexation and fencing. So we have these parallels to seeing the annexation of land from traditional peoples. And then we also have parallels with the environmental racism process that attends this long-term process. It's not the same, but this ethnicized stigmatization is very recognizable. The cultural and spiritual connections that pastoralists in East and actually many other parts of Africa and the rest of the world have with their land has been undermined, and very strongly through the education system. Children are routinely taught that their culture, their livelihood are backward and need to be forgotten. Low investment in these lands has tended to create an underclass. So all but the richest and the most canny, all of the who are trying to, if they try to operate outside the tradition of pastoralism, they find themselves in the underclass, many of them. And there's a strong suspicion of all those inside the tradition, if they stay as pastoralists, that they are untrustworthy, backward, irredentist, trying to create their own state, anti-development, even terrorist. And this is a rhetoric that's existed since these regions were used by the colonial powers as buffer states between one colonial power and another in East Africa. So environmental racism has a different look, but it's very much there in terms of a sense that these peoples are different from other peoples in the country, and to be wary of and to be put right. And then thirdly, the institutional obstacles that Felisa has pointed out so eloquently. The turning of institutions that were supposed to be for the public good of all different groups within society and the environment, against those peoples who are small or in the way of large-scale development, such as, in this case, oil exploitation. The way these formal institutions are used by the powerful to marginalize opposition has been very strong. So rights upholding institutions, they're generally weak anyway in East Africa, and local perceptions of their rights and power are also pretty weak. NGOs and academia spent an awful lot of time in workshops and on technical boards, in some ways mirroring what was happening in Brazil. And the central government has drawn power from local violent conflicts, exacerbated by the opportunities for annexation of land that have occurred through these new investments. And so the process of bare violence, you can see the slow violence going on there, but the process of bare violence has been, it's not so extreme at present, but it's certainly there. And I wanted to say then, in response to Felisa's challenge, which is how to produce scientific knowledge and counter-hegemonic speeches in a context of intense fragility of the state's regulatory institutions and its defense of rights and of the academy. I had some broad brush thoughts, which is that science, scientific knowledge, is not itself the origin of or the source of the change. The source is the power to define what scientific knowledge is made use of, what questions are asked, what methods are used to learn. And you can see how these can be suppressed in the process of the power of what is considered to be rights, rights to economic growth of a nation and so on. That institutions might frame a question and answer in favor of traditional peoples, but they're weakened by the fact that there's essentially a market for knowledge, and those who can pay the most tend to have the greatest say. So science is just showing very, very beautifully and clearly that the rights of a certain demeaned people who've been put into racist categories have been violated is always less powerful in times when the money orientation is the primary driver of political progress. The rights of demeaned people and a distant, a sort of less important environment are always going to be trampled. So part of the answer, I think, to Felisa's question lies in the question about revitalizing the institutions, which is no easy task. The institutions that regulate, that take on board, no easy task, because such a large proportion of all our populations have come to think that these institutions are corrupt and that these institutions haven't been and are not reliable for delivering on the public good. So they vote them away. And what you end up with? You end up with a worse situation. So for me, the science is actually for the traditional people themselves. It's providing them with the knowledge. So they do the science, they gain it, they gain the strength in addition to their strength of alliances and their strength of spiritual understanding and all of those things that Felisa talked about, that science becomes something that they also use in their fight against what are actually intensely fragile regulatory institutions, and therefore possibly open to being reformed into something which is fairer and something that takes account of the science and the environmentalism of these extraordinary peoples. So that was my little input. I shall end it there. and see whether we have any more comments or questions. Let's have a look. I don't think we do. It's 2:17. So just giving you a short chance if anybody would like to make any other points. We are still going to be online for another few minutes. Otherwise, let's see what happens. Felisa, you might want to add something.
I agree with you, Pat. The university is the space of the resistance too, right? The space to do the critique. So this is good, but for us in Brazil, we have suffering hard process of dismantling of the public university too. So I don't know. I put these questions, this question how challenging, because for me I don't know the answer to how will be. We are there resisting, but I don't know. I will go back to Brazil the next month, so let's see. But we are learning with these groups that we researched. If they are cornering for a long time, and now I guess we are cornered too in the universities. But we have to think the new strategies to do the resistance in the new context. So I have to think about this better.
Yes, the connection you've now made with us in East Africa, I think possibly is part of the new strategy. That alliance is so important. That the reason perhaps, you know, for doing these seminars and for writing and for engaging is all about keeping up the resistance and expanding the membership of this group who recognizes that, you know, there is another way is needed, otherwise there is a desperate situation before us. But we wish you huge strength, and we will not, you know, the whole idea is to stay together, as it were, even when you go back to Brazil and all you people who are already in Brazil and other parts of the world. We're trying to draw together a new alliance, to go beyond the incredible alliances that have already been created in order to be able to find new solutions to a massive difficulty. So thank you very much, Felisa, for a fascinating seminar, and we look forward to hearing the next stage, and may it go well.
Thank you too a lot, Pat, for the opportunity, for you and Alex too. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
On our side too. So with that, I think I'm going to, I don't know what the hosts think, but I think we're at the point where we should say the webinar is finished.